Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here this morning, so bright and early. We all just saw the sunrise. And I'm just so happy to see such a full house in here. Oh my goodness, there are a lot of people in this room. So this is amazing. And Carol from Davis Benefits and Pensions kept contacting me every day. She's like, Sofia, we have 5 more. Okay, we have 6 more registrants. So clearly this is a hot topic and one that I'm not alone in thinking that this is an important one. So I'm in good company with all of you today. I do want to thank the Davis Benefits and Pensions team for having me here and also for organizing events like this. Is it quarterly that this takes place, these events?
Twice a year.
Twice a year.
Yeah.
So this is amazing. It's an awesome opportunity for all of us, I think, as employers, employees, small businesses to learn from one another and really start applying some of these best practices in our workplaces. So I remember the last time I was here, I was thinking back to when it was, and I think it was 2012, and I was sitting at one of the tables back there, and the topic was social media and privacy in the workplace. And the first thing I did when I went back to my workplace was open up our employee handbook, flip right to the social media policy, and made a lot of revamps. That's what I did to make sure we were compliant. So that's my hope for all of us today, is that you're able to walk out of this session today and start applying some of these new learnings and aha moments and some tangible resources for you to be able to apply in your workplaces. So as I was putting this presentation together, it's always interesting. When I put a presentation together, I'm always interested to know who's out there in the audience. And so, of course, I tailor it accordingly. But this one here, as I was putting it together, I realized that this one hits closer to home than a lot of other topics that I talk about. And that's not to say that those topics are not important. Of course they are. Anything that's people related, it's up my alley. I'm in HR. So, of course, it's going to be something that I'm interested in. But succession planning is something that I've experienced firsthand. And so I know the impact it had on me then, the impact it has on me today, and the impact that it had on the firm. And so I thought I would share that story with you first, so we can start to understand the benefits for all stakeholders involved. So it was a time in my career where I was transitioning from the education field. I was in the education field for about 10 years. And I was transitioning into more of the corporate arena. So a very different ball game for me, a very foreign industry for me. And I accepted a role as an executive assistant in a public practice accounting firm. So I was supporting a few partners there. And it was about 5-6 months into my role, and one of the partners called me into his office. And so I went into his office. And I remember that meeting like it was yesterday, sat across from him. And he said, Sofia, it's been great having you here. You fit right in. You've learned really quickly. You've gone above and beyond in terms of supporting our partners. But, and I don't know about you, but whenever I hear like but or however in a sentence, especially if it starts off really well, I'm like, oh God, what's this going to be? But he continued and he said, but we think you're going to be bored in this role pretty quickly. And so us partners were talking, and we just see HR. We see you in HR. We think that'll be a great fit. And so I'm not sure if you know, but our HR manager is planning on retiring within the next 3 to 5 years, and we'd love to help groom you for that position and transition you into that role. So think about it and let us know, but we'd like to support you in that role. And so I remember walking out of his office, and for me, I felt incredibly respected and appreciated and valued and invested in. And of course, these are the feelings that I think we want all of our employees to feel, you know? And so for me, it was a no-brainer. It was a really quick yes. I think I said yes that exact day. And I said, yes, I would love to be, in HR. It's something I've done actually in my past roles. So I would love to do that. And so what the firm did was they supported me in terms of succession planning by, I went back to school and I got my post back in HR. I got my CPHR designation, and then they supported me with job shadowing as well. So they would take me out of my EA role, and then I would go into HR a couple of times a week to sort of, really learn the ins and outs of what the HR team did within that firm. And so it was a seamless transition. Within 3 years, I was able to transition into that role. and they set me up for success. And so for me, the impact was I was able to grow and learn and develop my skill set. I was able to enter an industry and a profession that I'm still passionate about today. I was able to advance in my career at a much faster pace had I not been given that opportunity as well. And the impact that it had on the firm was, quite frankly, it was a really good retention strategy too. Like thinking back, I stayed with that firm for close to 6 years. And at that time in my career, that's typically when there's a lot of movement that takes place as well. I had job offers, and some of the compensation was better. But my answer was always no. And the reason it was no was because I wasn't about to turn my back on a company that invested in me, that allowed me to spread my wings and fly, that gave me this amazing opportunity. I was invested in them, I was dedicated to them, I wanted to see them succeed, and I wanted to be a part of that success story. And so I wanted to highlight that story because as I talk to different firms, so these are different kind of industries that I've worked in right now as an HR consultant and in industry. I can tell you that the number one thing that clients say to me is, Sofia, it is really hard to attract talent, but it's even harder to keep them in the doors. So retention is tough. It's a competitive market. And so succession planning comes up as this is one facet or one area in HR in our businesses where we can start to retain some of our top talent within our companies. And so my objective in presentations like this is I want companies to start thinking, acting, and operating in a people-first culture. And so whatever that may be, but people-first culture meaning let's start focusing on the people side of the business because that will absolutely help our businesses thrive. And so succession planning is one way that we can do that because succession planning is all about skill development. It's about looking at who do we have in our doors and how do we help them grow and learn and advance in their career, whether it's advancement laterally in different positions at a lateral level or advancing upwards as well. So here is what we have in the room today. These are the different industries represented in this room today. I took a look at all the companies that all of you work at, and here's what we have. And I thought this was just amazing to see such a diverse spectrum here of different industries represented in this room alone this morning. Pretty incredible. We've got small businesses, medium size, large size, all over the map in terms of industries. And you're all here today to learn about succession planning, meaning it transcends all industries. This topic is a hot topic all around for different industries, regardless of size. So over the next hour, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to break it up into 3 sections. So the first one is I'm going to walk you through what is succession planning. So I often get asked, well, what's the difference between really replacing a position versus succession planning? Like, what's the difference on those two? So we'll define that. Next, we're going to go over the why. So why is it so important for us to start embedding succession planning in what we do and start putting it on our priority lists within our company? So why bother? And the last piece, I'm excited about this. You've got a bit of a handout in front of you. So we're going to go through the how. So granted, it's an hour. I could probably do succession planning and present out for a full day on succession planning, but I wanted to give you something that was a tangible resource that you can walk out of this room and start applying. So we will go through how do we build that talent pipeline, how do we discover who's next in line, and so that's what it's about today. Succession planning, building our bench strength, and determining who some of these next successors are for some of our key positions. Sound good? Ready to go? All right, so let's start with succession planning defined. So how do we define succession? So here's a definition for us. Okay, so I'm going to read it out loud verbatim here. A conscious decision by an organization to foster and promote the continual development of employees and ensure that key positions maintain some measure of stability. Some key words up there, highlighted in pink. Important words. But what you'll notice up here is I have not mentioned leadership anywhere up here. There's no mention of the level of the position. You have the sunshine right in your face. I'm going to block that sunshine for you so you can see. Okay, I'm going to try to stand here as much as possible for you. You'll notice I have not mentioned leadership up here, and there's a reason I didn't mention it up here. Oftentimes when we talk about succession planning, we often talk about critical roles, and in our heads, critical roles are really then leadership level, is how we look at it. I mean, I can't tell you how many conferences and workshops and articles I've read on succession planning, and typically it's around successors for leaders and leadership, VPs, presidents, managers, etc., executives, etc. But my take on it is we actually need to start looking at succession planning across the board, across all of our different positions in our organization. Because a lot of positions across the board, regardless of level, are critical roles. And so I'm going to give you an example of that. I was working with a law firm, and this law firm had an office manager that worked for them. And she was there for 18 years. And to put it really simply, she was a rock star. I mean, she was really good at what she did. She knew the ins and outs of that business. She knew all of the practice areas. She managed the associates and partners' calendars beautifully. She would pick up the phone and she would recognize a client's voice. And so she knew who the clients were. I mean, talk about client service right there, right? She was incredible at what she did. And 18 years she was there, 18 years. One day she comes in, she talks to the managing partner, and she says, okay, as you know, I've got 2 grandbabies. My daughter's going back to work full time, and I want to take care of my grandkids. And so I'm going to retire early. So a complete shock for the law firm, because they weren't thinking proactively. I mean, I think maybe they thought she'd be there forever. She was there for 18 years, right? But I can tell you, when she walked out of those doors, everything left with her. I mean, it was all up here, right? And it was no longer a well-oiled machine. I mean, she did a lot behind the scenes that made it seamless for everyone there. And so that was a wake-up call for me, going, well, you know what? With succession planning, let's start asking ourselves, like, if that person leaves tomorrow, will it be hard for us to replace that position? And if the answer is yes, then we need to start thinking about how do we start building people to, at least in the interim, fill these positions if we don't have someone that can permanently do that. Okay? So an easier definition of succession planning is all of what this. How do we build our bench strength and pipeline of talent? So it's looking internally and looking at who do we have in-house and how do we develop them even further so they can move into different positions. Now, I do want to say that there are a couple of people in this room, I believe, who are recruiters in this room. And so I want to mention something to the recruiters in this room. Recruitment is tough. It's not easy to find the right talent for a lot of these positions, especially in such a competitive market too. When I talk about succession planning, I'm not suggesting that we need to never look at externally sourcing candidates. That's not going to happen. You're not always going to have the right talent in your companies to move into different positions. So you're going to have to source externally. And there's a benefit of sourcing externally, actually, which is you get diversity in terms of experience and ideas and things like that as well. So recruiters out there, you have a really important job. And so all of us as companies, the thought process here with succession planning is let's look in-house to see what we can do with the talent that we have. Okay? So oftentimes I get asked, okay, well, this office manager that I just talked about in terms of the law firm, what's the difference between replacing her position versus actually having a succession plan in place? Here's the main difference. I would say replacement is very reactive. An event took place. The office manager left. So our job then at that point is, okay, we got to fill that spot, right? Well, we didn't have a job description. Nobody knew the ins and outs of what she did. We were scrambling to be able to find, okay, well, how do we even post the position? Who would be the best candidate for this position? I have no idea. So we're starting from scratch. Very reactive. Succession planning, on the other hand, is very proactive. It's a dynamic type process. It takes time. It takes planning. It takes forethought. Because really what you're doing is you're saying, okay, we're going to have other people job shadow this office manager over time so that should something happen, we have at least backups. So we don't have a huge gap to fill, you know, if we choose to go externally. And so replacement is all about firefighting, is the way I would look at it. It's firefighting. And succession planning is fire prevention, is how I would look at it. Okay. Replacement is also a form of risk management. The second she walked out of those doors, clients had no idea who to call. And they were probably used to that level of client service where they'd call and she'd be like, oh, hi, you know, hi, Joe, how are you doing? Yes, this and this. Like, she knew who people were, so they were used to that type of client service. That was gone. Partners and associates were a little bit lost with the status of client files at the time, right? So didn't know where to find things as well. Where did she save all of these things? Which drive was it? I mean, there was a lot of scrambling that took place, so risk management for sure. Succession planning is all about planning future development. So it's not just looking at roles today, but it's looking at what will that role look like in 2 years down the road and 3 years down the road, et cetera. Because roles don't stay stagnant. As our companies grow, as industries change, we have to also start looking at our jobs and start ensuring that they evolve over time as well. And the last one is short-term versus long-term, right? So office manager leaves, short-term is we need to fill that spot now, like yesterday. So we better fill that spot as quickly as we can, right? So short-term. Whereas succession planning, just like the example I gave you this morning, it's long-term. For me, it was a 3-year process. Sometimes it could be longer depending on the position, sometimes shorter, but typically it's a longer process to be able to get there. Okay. Any questions on the replacement and succession? Okay. So if someone asks me, okay, well, if we're choosing successors, like really what's it all about? Here's what I would say. You need 3 factors. All 3 need to, there needs to be interplay here between all 3 of them. And here it is. The first thing you need to do is you need to start looking at what can the person do. So like current state. What can this potential successor do today? Okay, so this is really looking at essentially their track record. Like, what's their performance like? What are some of the successes that they've had in previous roles or today in their role? So you're looking at what can they do. So most companies get this right. They're looking at successors and basing it on current state, what their abilities are. But you need can, and you also need could. So future state, what could they do? So these are potential predictors. Does this person have potentially the knowledge, skills, abilities, competencies to be able to fulfill these requirements of this role down the road? Right? So we're looking here at fulfilling future requirements. Could they do it? And the third one I find that companies don't look at is, well, do they want it? You may think that a successor may be fantastic, and you may say, oh, they can do it, and they could absolutely fulfill all the requirements. They're going to be a superstar. But maybe the person doesn't want to change positions as well. And I've met a lot of, I like to call them steady eddies, and they're super valuable for companies, right? These are people who are subject matter experts who don't necessarily want to transition into a different role. So if people don't want it, probably shouldn't be considered a successor. So we need to start asking people, well, what is it that you would like in your career? Would you like advancement? Would you like different opportunities? I'm going to use my husband as an example. His ears are probably going to be burning at this point when I mention him. But my husband, after he graduated from BCIT, he started working in a lighting company. And he's still there today. So over 25 years later, he's at the same company, right? That's rare to be in the same company for so long, because he's a lifer there. Currently he's a customer service manager. And there are opportunities. There are higher up positions for him. And can he do it? Yes. Could he? Yes. Does he want to? No. And the reason he doesn't want to is because we have that balance in our family. It just works for us in terms of our family obligations, et cetera. So he then wouldn't be considered or pegged as a successor for some of these positions, and the company knows that. So he's one of the steady eddies. He knows what he's doing, right? Subject matter expert's a go-to. So when we start getting to the how section, how do we start building succession plans? I want you to think about what can this person do, could they do, and do they want it? Think about these 3 different factors. So we understand what succession planning is. Next, it's, well, why is it so important? Why do we even need to bother? And this is important for all of us in this room. If we're struggling to get a little bit of buy-in from leaders potentially in our companies going, really, is this important? Do we really need to add this to our list of to-dos? Because succession planning is so important. No one's retiring anytime soon. Don't worry about it. I think we'll be fine. We'll be able to replace the positions. Well, this section is going to be important because we're going to talk about research that suggests, well, actually, it's mandated that we start looking at this stuff. And so I'll talk to you about it in just a moment. So one of the questions I asked you in the pre-work survey, and thank you so much, by the way, for participating in that. I really appreciated it. One of the questions I asked was, when I say succession planning, what one word comes to mind? And here's what you said. These are your words. And the size of the font doesn't matter, by the way. Oftentimes I get asked, like, does that matter? It doesn't matter. It's just a word wall. So here are the different words that you mentioned. So take a look at that. Show of hands, how many of you are surprised by what you see up here? I wasn't surprised either. That's good. I think that these words are absolutely bang on. Bang on. And actually, we've talked about some of these already when we talked about the definition, right? It's all about continuity. It's looking about talent, retention. It's about a retention strategy that I talked about earlier this morning with the story. And a little bit later, we're going to start talking about this section right here about what's next, and youth and demographics. We're going to talk about that in this section too. So bang on with what you said. And then my next question that I asked you in the pre-work survey was, well, what's one benefit then of succession planning? Because I wanted to hear from you to see what that benefit was. And I do want to mention actually that we had someone respond to the survey yesterday, so I wasn't able to put up the response, but I do want to mention it. Someone, for this slide right here, when I say succession planning, what one word comes to mind, someone inputted the word ugly. And I appreciate that you said that. I like that you said that because that's candid, that you're absolutely right. It can get messy and it could be really ugly if we don't adopt some of these best practices that I'll walk you through. So I appreciate that you said that because I think that's what sometimes the fear is, oh God, I don't know, it may hurt so-and-so's feelings, or it can get a little bit convoluted and a little bit messy if we don't adopt some of these best practices. So I didn't get a chance to put ugly up here, so I wanted to mention it. All right, so the other section was, well, what's one benefit of succession planning? And here's what you had to say. So take a look at this. Show of hands, how many of you are surprised about what you see up here with this one? Okay, yes.
It's all focused on the employer, not so much the employees, and it is one of the things employees ask for most is to know their future and their opportunities.
Great, great. So for those that didn't hear, it was this is very much, these words are focused around the employer rather than the employee. And sometimes the employees, I mean, they want to know, well, what are my opportunities here moving forward? You know, how can I progress with the firm? What does my future look like here? Okay, and we've mentioned a lot of these already with the intro as well in the definitions. And many of you actually said the words peace of mind or reassurance, something along those lines. But peace of mind was a big thing that you had all mentioned in this room. And so I wanted to put this up here because I think it's important that all of us understand the importance behind it. And so if I was asked, well, what are the benefits of succession planning? I would sum it up into 4 different sections. I'd say the first one is it's all about building, as you say, employees, that internal pipeline. This is what it's all about. It's looking in-house, who do we have? Let's build a highly skilled workforce within our company. That's going to give us a competitive edge. Optimization is the next one. The moment we start externally sourcing, and I think we can all agree in this room, it can get really expensive when we are recruiting, especially for higher up positions. It gets expensive. I mean, we're talking about, you know, obviously recruitment costs. We're talking about time investment too in terms of rummaging through emails, shortening the list, interviews, probably second interviews, probably third interviews if it's a leadership type position. Onboarding, all of those pieces, it's expensive. And so instead what you're doing is you're looking in-house and going, okay, so what can I provide for you? Sofia, job shadowing. Sofia, okay, we'll send you off to school, go get your post back, right? It's a lot cheaper than having to start from scratch essentially with a new hire. When your companies start embedding something like succession planning in what you do, you're going to have a more engaged workforce. This is definitely one area as well. The moment people know that they're going to be invested in and that there's a future in the firm and that you believe in their growth and learning opportunities, that increases engagement. And it also helps retain people, right? And at the beginning, we talked about how we're struggling to not just attract talent, but keep them in the doors. And so this is a strategy to be able to help us to go, you know what, we're going to invest in you, we believe in you, and we see a future here for you as well. And so let's work on that and see what that looks like for us. Okay. So let's talk about what research tells us. This is a great article from Deloitte. It's called The Holy Grail of Effective Leadership Succession Planning. Okay? And what they did was they interviewed, I believe it was 200 to 400 leaders across different industries, and here's what they found. So 86% of leaders said that leadership succession planning was urgent, but only 14% said that they did it well. So there's a disconnect. We know that it's important, like all of you in the word wall that we just saw, we know that it's important, but we're just not doing it right? It's not hitting the mark. And so we need to close that gap. And so my hope is that today, when we start looking at the how section in that structure, we're going to close that gap a little bit. Okay? At least 30% of newly hired executives fail in their first 18 months, and usually it's a poor culture fit. So think about the recruitment costs here, the training costs, the investment in this person. I mean, that's huge. And when you're doing succession planning, you know the cultural fit's already there because this person is working within your company, right? The fit's there. You're not starting from scratch to assess whether or not it's going to work out. 62% of employees say that they would be significantly more engaged at work if their company had a succession plan. I love this one. This was a high number. 94% of employers say that a succession plan positively impacted their employees' engagement levels. And let's talk about this one for a little bit. Over 90% of millennials say that working at a company with a clear succession plan would improve their level of engagement. Show of hands, how many of you have been to workshops, seminars, presentations about demographics, millennials? Okay, so the majority of us in this room. And so I want to start by saying this. I think that every generation thinks that the generation after them is the wild child, right? I think we can all agree. And so millennials are our wild child. However, I've worked with many millennials, and I can tell you that they're incredibly innovative. They think outside the box. They come with ideas that, I mean, honestly, none of us would have even have imagined. I mean, it's been fantastic. And so we have to remember that the majority of our workforce is going to be made up of millennials. But they estimate about 75% of our workforce by 2025 will be millennials. That's huge. So we're doing a complete disservice to our workforce if we're kind of going, not too sure what you're looking for in terms of an employer, in terms of what attracts you to a new employer or what will keep you there. We need to start looking at what that means for them. And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about our workforce here in Canada and why this warrants us starting to look at succession planning moving forward. First time in history, 2016, in Canadian history, our demographics in terms of those 65 and older exceeded the age group of those 0 to 14. First time in Canadian history, 2016, this happened. We know we have an aging demographic here in Canada. They're estimating right now that there are about 8,000 Canadians that are retiring every single week. They're estimating that 425,000 Canadians will retire each year. And of course, these numbers are, give or take. These numbers came from the Globe and Mail most recently, and 9.8 million Canadian baby boomers already approaching retirement or retired. Okay, so This is huge when we talk about the numbers of people that are close to retirement. So we know that as people are retiring, there are positions that we potentially need to fill as well. So how do we do that? How do we look internally to make sure we have the talent to be able to take over some of these positions? So what I urge you to do is when you go back to your workplace is take a look at some of the demographics that you have as well, right? So take on that kind of more fire prevention, proactive approach to look at demographics and say, okay, well, you know, is it a certain department, certain position, which positions? Do we potentially risk having people leave at sometime soon, whether it's the next 5 years or more? So start looking at that so we can start potentially moving people into job shadowing positions, et cetera, so we can start building that internal pipeline. Okay, here's how we're doing in this room. My last question on the pre-work survey was, well, okay, so how many of us have succession planning in our workplaces? So here was the result. 27% of you said, yes, we do. 57% said, no, we don't. And 16% were not too sure. So in other words, no. I was going to add them to the no, but I didn't. You're absolutely right. Or maybe it's just not formalized enough so they don't know if it's in there. But this was the result. And so I thought it was really important for us to highlight the importance behind it, because for those of you in the no and not sure section, potentially some of the benefits that we just talked about are conversation pieces with the leadership team as well. And for the 27% of you, I'd love to hear from you as well as to what's working when we do the Q&A in just a little bit. Anyone surprised about what you see up here with this slide? Yes. So surprised that we have 27% that say yes? Yeah. Yeah, I'll tell you that usually the numbers are much lower for the yes. Yeah, so for me too, I was kind of looking at, oh wow, that's great, 27%. I need to hear from these 27% of people in this room. This is great. Perfect. Anyone else? Anyone else surprised by what you see up here? Okay. I saw a lot of head nods when you mentioned that. So, all right. So let's now talk about the process and framework. Okay. So let's and you know, granted, this is an hour. We could build this framework a lot more. So I wanted to give you at least a structure so you can walk out of this room being able to apply it. So at your desks, you each have a bit of a handout. Right, this one right here. Okay, so let's go through it, and if everyone could grab a pen, we're going to do a couple of exercises now. So when it comes to succession planning, I would say that there are 6 important steps that we need to look at. And I'm going to go through each one in depth. Okay, so the first one is identifying those critical roles. In order for us to build succession plans, we need to know, well, what are those key positions that we need to look at? So identifying critical roles. The next one is, once we know what those roles are, what does success look like in those roles? And I don't mean just success today, I mean success in the future too, for those particular roles. The third one is nominate successors. So now we know what the role entails today and in the future, but who are these people going to be? Who we peg for these positions, right? What can they do, could they do, want to do? This is where we start nominating these successors. Once we have nominated them, we start to look at, okay, so what are the skills that they bring to the table today? And what don't they have, so we can start closing those gaps. So this is where the skills kind of assessment takes place. Then we develop them. We say, okay, so here's the gap, and here's the action plan, and this is what we need to do to get you to that position so we can transition you successfully. And here's the one that companies often miss, and I would say they miss it on almost every HR initiative, whether it's change management, anything. It's actually measuring whether or not it worked. So measuring progress is going to be important. Did this person transition effectively into this role? Was it the right fit? And maybe over time, like when I was transitioning into the role over 3 years, maybe, let's just say maybe year 2, maybe it was no longer the right fit. Maybe I would have been a better fit in this other position. So that's what I mean by it's a dynamic process. And so here are the 6 different steps, and we're going to go through it one by one. Identifying critical roles. What I wanted to do today is I wanted to give you this handout because really what it has is it has really important questions that you can ask yourselves in each of these different steps. And this will really start the process of identifying who these successors are. So identifying critical roles, what are the key positions in your organization? So here are some questions to ask. Which roles have the greatest impact on our performance in our organization? Which roles require specialized or unique expertise? And this one is super important. The more niche kind of skill set it is, the more difficult it's going to be to replace that position, right? And so start looking at that skill set that people have within these roles. And if it's very specialized, we know it's going to be tough to get someone else in their shoes. Which roles are geographically unique, one of a kind? And so I worked in telecoms for many years, and we had field service technicians dispersed in many different areas in BC, Alberta, Ontario, and some of them were very remote areas as well. And I can tell you when people left, it was very hard to fill those positions. And so start looking at geography as well. Do you have people working in remote locations where it may be hard to fill those positions? Which roles have a projected market shortage? So start looking at that too. Like start looking at our industry and what the future holds. Like will we have a shortage in a certain role? Are millennials maybe not interested in some of those roles? So then there'll be a shortage there too. So we need to start looking at that because if we have a shortage, what we're talking about is we have multiple employers vying for the same talent. It's going to be incredibly competitive to get that talent in our doors. And which roles are the most difficult to replace? Right? So that kind of sums it all up. So here are all of the questions that I would like you to consider, and I'd like you to take about a minute, grab that pen, and I want you to write down up to three roles that you can think of right now in your organization that would fit into this critical role. Which roles are critical roles in your organization based on these questions? I'd like you to jot those roles down for me. So what are those titles? So anyone willing to share, can everyone talk to me about some of the roles that you wrote down? I just want to hear the spectrum, what we have out here. Yes, sir.
The C-level.
Okay, C-level positions. Payroll. Yes. Say that again, I'm sorry. Parts and services manager. Yes. Engineering. IT. I love it. We've got the different departments in that going. So do you see like the spectrum of roles here as well? C-level roles, but we have some potentially other mid roles, maybe even entry-level roles here within the organization. So that's really important. We need to start looking across the board with what those critical roles are. So now what I'd like you to do is circle just one of the roles that you have written down because that'll be our focus for the other 5 steps that we go through. So choose whichever one you'd like to work on for the next 5 steps. Okay. So now we know what the role is. The next step is, well, how do we build a success profile? So how do we know what knowledge, skills, abilities, competencies are needed for this role today and in the future? Here are the questions you ask. So what competencies are required for the role right now? Right? So oftentimes or sometimes we'll have job descriptions that'll kind of have that mapped out already, what competencies are needed. And when I say competencies, what I'd like us to do is start looking at not just technical competencies, but also start looking at the soft skills too. Right? I hate calling them soft skills because I think they're the hardest skills to learn, but soft skills. Okay, so technical and soft skills. Start looking at that. And then ask yourself, well, are the competencies actually aligned to our strategy, to our vision, to our mission, to our values? Because as I said at the beginning of the presentation, our roles don't stay stagnant, and they shouldn't. They do evolve over time. As our companies change, roles change too. So let's start asking ourselves, well, do these competencies do we even still require them for this role moving forward? And then what are the anticipated future skill requirements for this role? So I can tell you, in telecoms, I joined a company. I was hired as an HR manager. And my role very quickly changed. We started implementing an HRIS system. I had never worked in an HRIS system, so that was added. There are always things that are added to your plate, right? And so oftentimes this is why we say job descriptions should be looked at probably annually, if possible, just to upkeep them.
Sofia,
Yes, yes,
I think
yes, sir.
what I want to share here is
Yes,
one of the things we're struggling with in our company is to identify where the business will be in the future.
right,
Here I'm looking at perhaps a 10-year time frame.
right,
For us, that is a struggle because it will determine how we do some of these things.
right, right,
And we cannot assume that everything remains the same. And that's how the difficulty is identifying what kind of, how we're going to do the business in the first place.
right.
How's the marketplace going to be? And
Mhm.
how we're going to get the people to support that business of the future.
Mhm.
That's where we're at.
Thank you for mentioning that. So it is not easy when we start to look at, well, what does the future hold for our company and what should it look like? I mean, that all is sort of the strategic planning side, and it's difficult for all of us to know what the future entails. And maybe we even anticipate that it'll look a certain way and then it doesn't as well. So we need to know that things will evolve and change over time. We'll have curveballs that come our way. My suggestion is, try to research industry as much as you can to see sort of what those market shortages are at least. I typically go online and start looking at not just competitors, but also across industries. What do those roles look like in those companies too? Maybe we can borrow and leverage some of that as well. Maybe we haven't captured everything that we could for specific roles. So there are different ways we could do that if we don't know specifically what that vision looks like for our company 10 years down the road, right? So this is important for us to look at. Oftentimes companies will look at, okay, well, Sofia, here's the job description and here's what our people do in this role right now. I'm like, that's fantastic, that's great. Let's talk about the future too. So what could the role look like? And so what I'd like you to do now with that one role that you've circled on your piece of paper, could you write down 2 competencies for me that you think would be important both now and into the future for that role? 2 competencies that you can think of. So here I'm thinking of innovative thinking could be a competency, right? So think of a competency, technical or soft skills, that would be important for this role. I think I'm going to ask you to share a little bit. All right, we ready to share? Okay. Some brave souls out there. Share with me. Yes.
We're looking for digitization, so someone that's digitally and automated knowledge. So
Okay.
especially in 10 years from now, our industry's going to change.
Better be tech savvy. Yeah.
And then I also put for soft skills, I put emotional intelligence and awareness.
Okay. So emotional intelligence and awareness, tech savvy, right? What was the other one as well? So there's the technical and soft skills competencies right there captured. Any other ones? Thank you for that. Yes.
Robotics.
What was that?
Robotics.
Robotics. Excellent.
Effective communication.
Effective communication. Anyone else? Okay, so do we see from those competencies alone that we've captured technical and soft skills, right? So that's what I'd like you to do. That's what I'd like you to do as we move forward is typically those competencies need to capture both, because as we evolve over time, you can be technically sound in a role, but there's also going to be a lot of elements where we need to have those soft skills embedded in what we do as well. Okay. Number 3. So now we know what the success profile looks like today and into the future. Now it's, okay, so who do we have? Who do we have under this roof or in our company to be able to take over these positions? And so this is where you start nominating successors. So identifying those people who could move into these critical roles. I'll go through the questions and then I'll mention something. So here are the questions that you could ask yourself. Does the individual have the knowledge, skills, ability and desires, that want factor, to be able to take over this position and fulfill the role. When will they be ready to take over this role? So if they had offered me that HR manager position, and let's say they quickly found out, oh, Sofia needs maybe 6 years to get into that role instead of the 3 years, I'm probably not going to be a successor for that role because the transition wouldn't have happened. They needed someone faster in that role. So think about the timelines as well as to readiness for that position. Does this fit into our timeline? And are an appropriate number of candidates being identified? Now, some of you may have small businesses where you're not going to have multiple successors nominated for positions, and that's fine. Some of you may be larger organizations where you may have a few. That's almost as backup. But let me tell you that the moment you go up to somebody and you say, you're going to be considered a successor for a role, in their heads, they're going, awesome, I've got the role. Right? So there's a lot of damage control that may have to take place the moment you have a conversation like that. So oftentimes the way I would approach it with clients is saying, you know what, let's start building a culture of skill development and growth and learning opportunities. And so that's how we approach it with goal setting. What would you like to see? What's your talent profile? What would you like to see in the future? Let's start building action plans and goal setting in our annual reviews, etc. That then becomes sort of a prelude to who those successors are and having those conversations once you've nailed them down. So just remember, the moment you have that conversation is when they believe that you've promised them the position. So those conversations are important. So this is what you would ask yourself in terms of nominating who those successors are. And here I would look at diversity too. As you're looking at successors for positions, do you have a diverse group that have been nominated as these key positions moving forward? Okay. Next one is you have nominated these people now for this position. Next is, well, what are their skills? What are their skills? So this is where you're going to conduct that assessment to see what where their talent lies and what the gaps are. So questions. How long will it take to get the potential successor in place? What specific training is needed as well? Okay.
Sophia?
Yes.
Can you recommend any type of skills assessment tools available to assess skills?
The way I've often done it is typically because there are competencies and competency grids, typically in the companies I've worked at with telecoms and public practice accounting, it would be measured across that. So it would be essentially looking at each of the competency buckets or functions or expectations in each role and seeing, well, where do they lie? Have they met all of that? Have they exceeded? Have they not met it? I can look that up for you. That's a great question. Great question.
Sophie, do you ever use
Yes.
Colby?
No. Talk to me about it.
It's conative, so it's your natural instincts, striving instincts.
Mm-hmm.
So it's there's only one test. It's Colby.
Okay.
C-O-B-E. So organizations will do a B, which is the job. So they'll see if their striving instincts match. It doesn't matter whether they have the skill set,
Right.
because they'll learn it if they fit what the other excellent people have done.
Right. Colby.
Colby.
Okay, I'm going to look that up. That's great. Perfect. Thank you. Anyone else? How do you assess skills in your organizations?
We use
Yes.
something called predictive index.
Predictive index.
Yeah, have you heard of that one?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
We use that a lot.
Okay. And do you use that across the board for different positions?
We use it for different departments. So if we have a department that's experiencing high turnover, we definitely do a pro, so we analyze the actual job, and then the people that are in the role, see how they match and how they fit.
Okay.
We see the ones that have left the company generally not always fit the role. So, yeah.
Predictive index. Great. Anyone else?
Yeah,
I love that, no.
I've used predictive index as well in the previous role.
Yeah.
Currently we're using Harrison assessments. And Harrison assessments based on the enjoyment theory. So it assesses whether, it doesn't assess whether the person can actually do the job, but whether they enjoy doing the job.
Okay. That desire part that we talked about before.
The happier you are,
Yeah.
the success is going to be.
Great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write those 3 down, and then I'll send it out in an email to everybody so you have that listing. Does that work? Okay. Beautiful. So we're going to start assessing people's skill set at this point, and this is really to determine, well, what are the gaps and how do we fill them? So the fifth step then is developing talent. So at this point we know, okay, so for my example that I gave you this morning, I had experience in HR, but I didn't necessarily have the credentials, right? I didn't have my CPHR designation. I didn't have my HR degree. So that was the gap for me, is I really needed to have that in order to move into that managerial role. And so developing talent is setting the appropriate goals and making sure that they have time to prepare for that succession. So it's hopefully a seamless transition. It's not too ugly to move into that role. So what are the specific areas of opportunity? Where do they need to grow and learn? What are the resources available to hone in on these areas? So this one for me, it's not strictly programs. It's not strictly, workshops and professional development. It could be internally job shadowing with one person or multiple people across the organization. You can get really creative with how you fill this skill gap for people. And I can tell you that when I worked in telecoms, it was one of the most beautiful things where I was able to go on a ride along with a field service technician and really understand what they did. It was amazing for me to sit with a call center and go, oh, so this is what the calls sound like, and this is what people ask. That's great. So I was able to understand then the business because I had those opportunities to sit with different people. So if you have that opportunity, that would be amazing to be able to do that, and that's where people can start honing in on those skills. And the question you need to ask yourself was, well, okay, so we've determined the successor, and we know what the skill gaps are. Well, do we have a development plan in place? Or is it just all like verbal? So let's have a development plan in place, because that's what's going to help us with the sixth piece, which is, are we measuring it then? Are we looking at it? Typically when I do a development plan, I think we all know like SMART goals, right? So is it time bound? Do we have deadlines there? Are there specific steps, people maybe that they need to meet? What are the objectives? So really start to build a comprehensive action plan for these people so that they can transition into these roles successfully. Any questions on this one? We'll have an open Q&A as well. Okay. And the sixth one is tracking progress and measuring it. So let's say they moved me into that role, they wanted me to be in HR, they built me an action plan, and if I later tell them, oh yeah, I'm not interested in doing the CPHR designation. I don't know, I'm probably going to hold that off for a little bit, or, oh, job shadowing, no, I'm good with the EA role. Like they have to measure it to make sure that I'm still ready. The readiness is there and the desire is still there to move into that position. That's why it's dynamic. And that's why sometimes companies, if they have the ability to, they have a backup as well. So, tracking progress. Are you diligently meeting with this potential successor? And we could do a full-on presentation on performance meetings and performance management and those kinds of things, right? The annual review and meeting them one time a year isn't going to be enough. Same here. It's not going to be enough meeting them once and saying, you're the successor, here's your action plan, go ahead. And in 3 years, you're going to move into that role. We need to have those touch points. And are the successful candidates performing well in their new role? So when I started transitioning into that HR managerial role, really it was important for them to kind of check in and go, Sofia, what else do you need in order to set you up for success? I mean, that HR manager is now gone, so what else do you need? Okay, so that's really important as well to continue to build that momentum. So those are the 6 steps with questions that you can ask yourselves. Hopefully you can wrap your heads around kind of who those successors are, what they need moving forward as well. So some key questions that you can ask. I'm going to send you something that looks like this tomorrow, but a little bit fancier. And it's an Excel spreadsheet, and it has a couple of drop downs and things like that. So I'll send this to you either today or tomorrow. But basically, it's a succession chart that you can start using. And typically, this kept me on track to kind of know when the dates were that we met with people within the organization and just what their track record was, right? So here we have Jane Smith. She's currently a CEO. She's been in her position for 2 years and a month. And then here's where you'd list all the past successes. So that's going to be, what can she do today? Well, she reduced company expenses by 10%. Jane is awesome. That's great. What's the future role? We'd like her to be our president. She'll need such and such training moving forward to develop her skill set, because that's the gap. We're going to move her in by October 24th, 2022. And it's going to take her about 2 years. Time for readiness. Keeps it on track. So I think the one I send you is going to be a little bit color coded too. Like if it's not started, it'll be red. It'll have fancy, red, yellow, green kind of stuff. So I'll send that out to you in just a moment. So feel free to use that. And you can make it as fancy and in-depth as you like. You can put a full-on action plan in here as well. So we've gone through what succession planning is. We've gone through why it's important. We've gone through how do we actually do it. And I wanted to give you a couple of resources as well that you can look up. Show of hands, how many of you have seen something like this, the 9-box grid? Okay, so a few. So there are many variations on this 9-box grid. Take a look. You can just Google 9-box grid for succession planning, and there'll be tons that come up. But basically for this, when you start nominating successors, so in that step of step number 3, nominating successors, to try to take out as much subjectivity as possible, this is a grid that some companies use to say, okay, well, is this person a superstar, and should we kind of expedite and get this person in a role really, really quickly? Because we don't want to lose that talent. And so typically on the y-axis here, we have potential, and on the x-axis is performance. So if someone has high performance, high potential, I call them a rock star, but they could be a consistent star too, right? So looking at these 3 are going to be important because these are people that you don't want to lose in your organizations. This is top talent that we're talking about. Okay, so you could use a 9-box grid. This to me is still not in depth to remove some of that subjectivity. I believe that you need some characteristics, some KPIs in there in each of these boxes, because when one person asks, well, why is so-and-so a successor and I'm not a successor? Like, I think I have the same skill set. Then you actually have some measures to be able to go back and say, this is what's missing, or this is what the gap is. And so let me show you something that I saw at one of my HR events that I went to. I recognize that for the people at the back, it's going to be hard to see, but here's the objective. They've taken the 9-box grid and they've moved it into a 4-box grid, so you can play around with it however you like. And what they've done is they've put in each grid the characteristics that are involved and what the expectations are. Right? I mean, this is sort of bare bones. Like, they had a much bigger version of this, but this is important because what it does is you can actually have that really in-depth conversation with someone saying, here are all the characteristics that you possess. Therefore, we're going to expedite, or you're going to be moving into a position within the next 3 to 5 years. So this breaks it down really nicely. So this is going to involve playing around with the 9-box grid and making it your own within your firms and organizations. Yeah. This is where the support is definitely needed. It's low potential, low performance. So we're going to have to work on this group right here. But this one right here is green for a reason. We need to build them into our succession plans to retain that talent. So to close off, I'm going to give you a couple of best practices, and then we'll open it up. Buy-in. I would say any type of initiative, it doesn't matter what the initiative is, we have to have buy-in at the top. If we don't, it's going to fall flat, right? So take that why section, some of those stats, start looking at your industry, start seeing why we need to have succession planning, and start to add that on our priority list within our organization. We need to have buy-in at the top. The next one is, even if we don't do succession planning, let's start in our organizations offering opportunities and rewarding people and recognizing when we start knowledge sharing. Give people these opportunities where they can share their knowledge and transfer some of their knowledge. That office manager that left after 18 years, how amazing would that have been if other people within that firm knew what she did and had that opportunity to learn from her? She was masterful at client service. What an amazing opportunity for other people in that firm to learn from her, to learn from the best, right? So promote knowledge transfer and sharing as much as possible. Here's a biggie. That HR manager that retired with the firm I was at, and I would say any retiree, the worst thing we could do is make them feel like they're being pushed out the door. So involve them in the process as much as possible. Have them help us with identifying who those successors are. Let them help with the action plan of what this person needs and how they can build success into what this person's going to do. Include them in the process. It's going to be really important because you want that knowledge transfer as well, right, to take place. I often get asked, well, whose responsibility is succession planning? It's yours, right? It's HR. And my answer to that is no. I think HR is more of advisory and to support with the process. I would say it's our line managers. I think our managers need to have some accountability when it comes to succession planning. They're seeing the work of our employees day after day. They know what that talent is, and I think that they should be held accountable for wanting to leave the organization better than maybe when they joined, right? So building that potentially into our KPIs and how we measure our manager performance, I think is going to be very important. We talked about this, review demographics, so we're proactive, fire prevention, and just make sure that these conversations are taking place, right? The moment these conversations take place is when people start recognizing that our culture involves developing our people. It means that we're invested in our people. It means our people are not just sort of people that we can brush aside at the end. We care about them. So those feelings that I talked to you about at the beginning of the presentation after that meeting with that partner, where I felt really appreciated and respected and valued and invested in, that's what we want. And that's how people feel when you have those conversations with them. So please don't do this anymore when you go back. Please don't do this. Let's start wrapping our heads around succession planning. And it doesn't matter what format it takes. It could be incredibly formal. It doesn't have to be, but look at how you can start embedding this into your organizations. And I'm going to leave you with this quote. So, money is just a commodity, talent supplies the edge. And I believe that the moment you start looking at the talent within your organizations and the people side is when you're going to have that competitive advantage. So that was a lot of talking. So thank you so much for being a receptive audience and asking your questions as well. And my hope is that you have learned something today where you can start applying it, just like I did that day and I started revamping our social media policy. I hope you go back and do the same with your succession planning and looking at how you assess your talent within in-house. Okay. So thank you for being here.